Okay, so welcome everyone to our session on lots of science diplomacy and putting your career on a global stage. And it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marga Gual Soler, who is a prominent figure in the field of science diplomacy, currently serving as the head of science diplomacy capacity building at the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, also known as GESDA. Her career has been dedicated to advancing science diplomacy as a growing area of research, policy, and education on a global scale. Dr. Gual Soler's contributions have extended to governments, universities, international organizations, and scientific institutions worldwide, where she has worked sorry, to reinforce the role of science in addressing common challenges and navigating geopolitical transformations. A molecular biologist by training, following her PhD, she transitioned into the realm of multilateral diplomacy at the United Nations, where she contributed to the integration of science into the sustainable development agenda. She is a founding member of the EU Science Diplomacy Alliance, and her achievements also extend to participating in the largest ever Women in STEM expedition to Antarctica and being recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. So, Marga, we're so happy to have you here. And so everyone who I haven't met yet at Johns Hopkins, I'm Ona Brozete. I am the Science Diplomacy Chair and the President of the Johns Hopkins Science Policy and Diplomacy Group, and I'll be moderating today's session. So Marga, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ona, and very nice to see everyone and meet everyone. First, I want to check that my sound is okay. Yeah, and my video as good as possible. I am at the airport, which already tells you a lot about what I'm going to talk about today, about what this career is like. I'm very excited to be able to have a bit of a different presentation today about careers. I really love talking about careers, and I'm really excited to see the ever-growing range of options that scientific careers have. I imagine that most of you in the audience are in your PhD postdoc stage. Is that right, Ona, to assume? Yep. And so it is a very important moment for you in your career. And I remember I was there where you are, thinking about my options. And I want to just tell you a little bit how I navigated my path, and hopefully some of the tips and lessons and stories that I will tell you can be useful for you. And of course, feel free to ask any questions, or I will try to be brief so we can have a Q&A. I think we have 20 minutes, 25. Just I want to make sure I get the time right. I have tried to give you a text-free presentation, only with pictures. Let's see if we manage. And so hopefully it's a bit more entertaining than your usual PowerPoint deck. So let me just start from the beginning. We'll share my screen. And let's see if this works. Let's see. Is this now? Yeah, you see, great, perfect. So I titled the presentation instead of my career. I thought that was kind of too standard of a title. Science diplomacy takes you places. So I will talk about how I went from the world of science, very lab and research focused person, to a completely unexpected world that I didn't know existed at the time for a scientist, for somebody like me. And what you see in this slide is a selection of very kind of unexpected places that science has taken me, science and diplomacy together. The picture on the left is the Vatican. The middle is the largest civilian sailing vessel in Italy. The top right is Antarctica, and the bottom is scuba diving, the first Hercules C-130 plane that was sunk in the Red Sea in front of the coast of Aqaba in Jordan. So this gives you a little bit of a taste. And I will say all of these experiences were work related. So I was not on vacation. And actually one of the curse of this work is that you basically never go on vacation, because you're always in very cool places, but you're always working. So then you don't have time for vacation. But I guess that compensates. So let me start from the beginning. So I am from an island in the Mediterranean, um, Mallorca in Spain. And this is the picture on the left. This is the view that I wake up every day. And so I'm very privileged to have grown up in a wonderful place. But I don't know if any of you are from islands, but when you grow up in an island, at some point you start to feel that the territory is getting small and constrained, and you kind of long for more distance and space, and the travel bug starts to hit. So I went to study molecular biology in Barcelona, the University of Barcelona. And as I said, I was for many years completely traditional mainstream laboratory person. I did a degree and master's, and I was, I think, not convinced, but I think by default, I was headed towards an academic career because I didn't know that there was anything else. I didn't know there were more options that I could pursue at the time. And so this is important for later, but I think, and I'll try to kind of give lessons and tips learned in every stage. I think this has changed a lot now, and thanks to this conference and thanks to groups like the Science Diplomacy Group at Hopkins and Hubs, and many now really exciting initiatives are emerging that present different career pathways to PhD students and postdocs that didn't really exist at the time. And so that was my life for the first 7-8 years of my studies. When I finished my PhD, sorry, I need to clear my. And I'm giving a talk. Yes, no, that's fine. Okay. To put this here. No, it's okay. It's okay.
Thank you very much.
No worries. The perks of being at the airport. So as I was saying, that was my life. Yeah, Ana is laughing. Yeah, exactly. That was my life for the first 7-8 years of my career, my professional life. And when I finished my PhD, I started to, towards the end of my PhD, I started to wonder whether there was anything else than my, petri dish and my cells and my daily experiments. And also at the time, the question of the science for sustainable development was very, very prominent. I started to get more and more on Twitter when Twitter was cool, not anymore. But Twitter was really a place where scientific communities were starting to kind of branch out and build these other dimensions beyond pure research. And there was this hashtag that I discovered, science diplomacy. And that was around 2011, 2012. So very early on. And I started to kind of get into a rabbit hole on Twitter. I started to connect with people that were looking at science in a much broader way in terms of science policy, science diplomacy, science and society. So how can scientists have a bigger impact, not just by publications and research, but by engaging and contributing to policy discussions, global governance, and so forth. So I stumbled across the internship program of the United Nations. I didn't know it existed. So I just, for fun, curiosity, I emailed the program director and I asked, do you take scientists in this internship program? Because I would be interested. And he replied saying, actually, we don't really have scientists. We don't really, have a kind of a goal for them. Most of the interns here have backgrounds in international relations, political science, international law, kind of the diplomatic traditional backgrounds, if you will. And I said, well, I just finished my PhD and I would love to help the UN. And that was, my self in that moment. I would love to help the UN in all the issues that you work on, like climate change, global health, ocean, plastic pollution, agriculture, food security, because these are scientific issues. You must have scientific topics to work on. And they were like, well, yeah, not really. We have academics that come in for a day or two, and we have these meetings, they write a report, and then they go back to university. So there was no scientific kind of workforce within the UN Secretariat that could help translate that science into the policy of the diplomacy process. And it was a very interesting time because it was the moment of the transition from the Millennium Development Goals. Many of you perhaps are too young to remember the MDGs. That was the precursor of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDGs that we know now, the 2030 Agenda. So at that time, I was very curious to know how they were handling on all the scientific topics. So long story short, I decided to give it a go. And I said, I'm going to come, I'm going to, just hang out and see how you work and try to elucidate the inner, mechanics and work of the UN. So I spent 6 months basically printing name tags and distributing documents in the negotiation meetings. But that allowed me to be exposed, to understand how that world operated. And because they didn't know what to do with me in terms of the internship court, I started to research and I produced a report. And from that report, I basically, I tried to analyze and give my perspective of what would be the role of scientists in the UN. So I wrote this article in Science 2013, and also a proper report that's in the UN archive somewhere. And that really opened the door for a whole new world, because I had that paper in hand and I started to knock doors of places and say, hey, there should really be more scientists in all of these spaces. And I didn't want to be the first and the last. What I wanted, I saw that there was a niche, there was a space to build a bridge and to sustain a bridge and to say, how can we have more like me? How can we have it in a structured way, not just a random, serendipitous or just by, self-motivation, but structured pathways. So the natural place to go and do that is Washington, D.C. And I know many of you are involved in policy, might be looking at AAAS fellowships or congressional fellowships or other types of fellowship programs. And I realized that this structured pathway for scientists to diplomacy or scientists to policy existed, but only in the US and in a few other countries like the UK, very, very few, right, at the time. And so I joined AAAS in 2014 as a research scholar, trying to look at these mechanisms and how to build more capacity and more pathways for science diplomacy. And I spent a wonderful 5 years in DC. And at the time, if you remember, it was the Obama administration. It was the flourishing of science diplomacy in the U.S. government, but also outside with AAAS, with the national academies. Many initiatives really trying to build this field of science diplomacy, and a lot of universities starting to create their science diplomacy clubs and hubs. The NSPN was born. So that was a wonderful momentum for these structured pathways for engaging scientists in diplomacy that didn't exist before or didn't exist in other countries, right? For me, coming from Spain and having spent until that time, my time in Europe and in Australia, it didn't really exist as such. And so in Washington, I was privileged to work on a very special project, very special. So we had different in the Center for Science Diplomacy. One of them was engagement between the US and countries that had no diplomatic relations with the US, including North Korea, Iran, Syria, Cuba. So because I spoke Spanish and I had a favorable passport, and that's also another second lesson, I was able to lead the project of scientific cooperation between the US and Cuba. And you will recognize some figures in these pictures, such as obviously Peter Agre, who is a pioneer, champion, and one of the leaders of science diplomacy in the world, but of course very close to you. And this was really my realization that science can open doors, build bridges, and provide this shared language, even in the most difficult political, ideological, economic situations of difference. Really, that was for me the proof that there were many reasons to work together in terms of ecosystems, in ocean issues, disaster reduction, of course, global health, infectious disease, cancer. We worked with Cuban researchers for 5 years in advancing this agenda. And what's very important here, two things. One is that building those relationships is never, you never know when the work will pay off. You never know when, if you're working towards something that you don't know when will come, and you have to be ready. So then in 2014, President Obama and President Castro announced the normalization of diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba. And thanks to all this work in the non-governmental academic research space, we were ready to put something on the table and say, okay, the first agreements that you can sign, the first official diplomatic bilateral agreements between the US and Cuba in 59 years, they can be scientific. So then the agreements came in with NOAA, in oceans and climate, and with NIH and others in global health. So this really shows that you sometimes don't know what you're working towards. And then the opportunity comes and you have to be ready and you have to know how to grasp it and make the most of it. And then the other lesson of this work was that I had a passport that was favorable for this work. I was not a US citizen. I was not, I didn't have a green card or any of that. And I know in DC, there's been a lot of conversation about how can international students, international scholars access this type of fellowships and science policy opportunities. But actually, because I had a non-US passport, I could do this work because Spanish citizens can go to Cuba without restriction. The US citizens were not permitted to go to Cuba. Therefore, that I turned a disadvantage into an advantage in that sense. And of course, speaking the language and having a very similar culture helps a lot with diplomacy. It's not just the science, but everything that goes with it. So that was a very important lesson as well. But then something happened. There's not COVID before. Another thing happened that was not very conducive to science or diplomacy, and I'm very open about it. It was the arrival of the Trump administration, and a lot of the ecosystem and the conditions and the circumstances that were conducive to science diplomacy in the previous administration were no longer. For example, new sanctions were reimposed of travel restriction on Cuba, and it was really becoming very difficult to continue this work. So I decided to come back to Europe, and I was at the time the EU was getting on this train of science diplomacy. So the EU was working to define a science diplomacy strategy for the European Union, and this is the former Commissioner for Research and Innovation, Carlos Moedas, who appointed me to to a high-level panel to advise on what it means for the EU to have a science diplomacy strategy. And here I had a huge imposter syndrome because I was the youngest of that panel, and I had been out of Europe for too long. I was not really familiar with kind of the EU, context. My memory was from more than a decade ago. So I really had huge imposter syndrome. Am I qualified? Am I legit to be in this room with these people, advising and discussing these issues? And I think this is something that happens a lot to many of us when we branch out our kind of comfort zone or domain of expertise, and you have to very quickly adapt to not being comfortable, to not being the expert, and to sometimes have to improvise and not know what comes next. And I remember here, I realized how I was becoming really a generalist. So my background that I was very safe in, talking about molecular biology, biomedical sciences, that was my space. I would feel super comfortable. Then, in this phase, I was talking one day about climate change, the next day about energy, the other day about astronomy. So it was really out of my expertise, and this is very tricky. If you're interested in kind of science of life, science policy, science diplomacy role or space, it's always very tricky because you don't want to kind of step out of your expertise and not be rigorous and not be accurate. But at the same time, you have to become a generalist. You have to be able to very quickly identify what are the scientific issues, what are the diplomatic issues, and then know who to call for deeper expertise. But kind of the first layer of screening is you, right? And so if you talk, for example, to the science attachés at embassies or science advisors at State Department and all those speakers, they're dealing with so many subject matter issues that nobody can be an expert in everything, right? So that also is a big kind of mental shift that you have to do as a scientist to learn to not be always the expert and to be comfortable outside of your expertise. And then so that was 2019, and then that was the month before COVID, 2 months before COVID hit, and we all got trapped at home in Zoom. And then I don't have many cool pictures of those years because I was like sitting on Zoom all day. But before that, I was very privileged to participate in this expedition. It was the largest women in science expedition to Antarctica ever. It was organized by an NGO from Australia called Homeward Bound. And this was for me a dream, because working in science diplomacy, those of you who know about it, you will know that the most important, the first and the landmark example of science diplomacy is the Antarctic Treaty, and how scientists came together to declare, and scientists and nations came together in 1959 to declare Antarctica a global common and a space that will be dedicated to science and peace. And so being able to experience, in the flesh that place, and how this science and diplomacy come together, it was absolutely incredible. We visited the different research stations from China, UK, Spain, and you realize that in those places, researchers and scientists really work together without regard for where they're from or what their political position is. It truly is science is a global language that unifies all of them, and this was really a dream come true to after studying something for so long, to be able to experience it in the first person. And so then COVID came, and I like many of us who got stuck at home and on Zoom, and so no pictures from those years. But as soon as the pandemic was starting to phase out, I got a call from a former colleague that there was a new organization being created in Geneva called Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, GESDA. And it was a very interesting approach, a very interesting proposal to not work on science diplomacy issues of the present, but work on science diplomacy issues of the future. So that means that we work on governance and diplomacy for science and technology that hasn't been invented or deployed yet. So things like, for example, quantum technologies, or geoengineering governance, for example, fusion energy. So the science breakthroughs that are going to become diplomatic and geopolitical issues that need this kind of anticipatory governance framework. And we need to think about it now and not wait to react to them like we have done with AI, or like we did with, for example, gene editing, right? That we always kind of governance comes behind and catches up with the science. So it was a whole set of new skills, for example, foresight, right? There's a whole world of foresight, of anticipation that I had to learn to come into this work, and every step of the way, basically, you keep adding new skills to your toolkit, and just keeps expanding. And this is where I'm right now, and this is the photo of the UN headquarters in Geneva. This is a science diplomacy week that we run every spring, May, June, and I invite you all to apply for the next cohort, which is going to be announced in a few weeks, if you're interested in coming to explore the science diplomacy ecosystem of Geneva. I know that I'm out of time, but I wanted to just share the snapshot of where I am today. Like, I'm speaking to you from Vienna. I spent 2 days in a meeting at the International Agency for Atomic Energy, and I was exactly talking about future governance of fusion energy. And it's really amazing when you are in these spaces that you realize how history, it's basically history in the making, and how much of the world's events have happened in those walls. So I wanted to just share with you a few of the screenshots. This was all today, so it's really fresh from the day. And what really struck me in this building is to see that this type of international science diplomacy organizations, for example, have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. So the IAEA got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. Also, the IPCC has got Nobel Peace Prize. So all of this, work that we do, and it seems sometimes the day-to-day, it's not really advancing, it's not moving the needle. You see all this conflict and political situation, we can become very negative and jaded. But I think reminding us that what we're working towards peace, we're working towards multilateralism, working towards using science for the benefit of all it's a very important goal, and we don't have to forget that. So if you're thinking about what to do with your career in terms of where to take your expertise, there will be more and more need for scientists that can integrate in these diplomatic processes and can be these bridges and basically sit at that interface and be able to talk to the scientists technically, but also to the diplomats and become basically bilingual or multilingual in science and diplomacy. And this is what we're trying to do at JESDA, and what I'm trying to do as the head of science diplomacy capacity building, to try to get as many people as I can to walk that path that I walked 10 years ago when I entered the UN building in New York, but not as in with random serendipitous intern, but with an actual pathway, with skills, with competencies, with support, and with a career pathway that can be sustainable over time. Because I'm very aware that a lot of these careers look quite fancy, but then there's very small numbers of positions that you can get into. So I think we have to also work. Those of you working on the in organizations where you are in a position to kind of foster, and the demand side for science diplomacy is very important. So it's not only about more training and more skilling in science diplomacy, it's about the recognition of the functions and the roles that need to be created to uptake these profiles and new careers and new ways of using and doing science. So here's another summary if you want to read it about. This is mostly about the work in Cuba, and then I also I can leave you with a TED talk that I also in 13 minutes try to explain the journey last year at the TEDx Graduate Institute in Geneva. So I hope this is a very quick overview, but I hope this resonates, and I can hopefully support some of your thinking. And I would love to answer any questions or comments about anything I covered, and things I haven't covered. So thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, so I will stop here.
Sounds good. Thank you, Marga, so much. I'll applaud because, so I actually don't even know if we have time for questions, since the next sessions I think are happening now. Marga, if you're okay with that, there were a few questions on the Hoover app. And I'm sure you can access that as well. There were a few questions, for example, how do you stay true to your authentic self despite these expectations from different cultures of what a leader might look like or act like? So people are very much interested in your work, Marga. And as you know, at Johns Hopkins, we have a very active science diplomacy and policy group. So we agree on behalf of the group, yes, and everyone in the community, you have to be, like you said, bilingual, right, in science and diplomacy. So thank you so much, Marga, for that. And there's never enough time. When you're passionate about what you do, it's never enough time. So yeah, thank you, Marga. Yeah.
Thank you so much, all. And I love this question, and I would love to engage with whoever asked it, because when you get into political, especially with sensitive and difficult political relations, it's very easy to be mistaken or to be misinterpreted, and you'll be criticized, and you have to exactly stay true to yourself that you're doing this for a bigger purpose and not supporting certain regime or certain, like, or you're not selling yourself or the integrity. It's a very important question, and I would love to have the space to answer maybe bilaterally with the person that asked. So thanks so much for bringing that up. It's a very important point.
Thank you so much, Marga, and safe travels. Don't get stuck in the airport. Yes. So hopefully all goes well. Thanks, Marga, so much, and thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy the conference. Bye.
Good luck with the rest of the conference.
Bye.
Ciao.